Hello, welcome back. I am still Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred. And in today's reading, I'm going to read a passage where Martha Sweezy, in her book, Internal Family Systems for Shame and Guilt, um, she works with a client with a suicidal part. And in traditional therapy, it can be really, for anyone, it can be really overwhelming and scary for a client system, for a therapist. Um, the whole system usually is very afraid of suicidal parts. The beautiful thing in IFS is that we understand that every part has a good intention. And if we can figure out what the suicidal part is trying to protect the person from, then we can offer hope and help, that we can go and help that part. And we can recognize the good intention and kind of the desperation of that part. Often suicidal parts are at the top of the hierarchy of firefighters. So maybe there's, binge working and then binge eating and then binge drinking and then gambling and risky sexual behavior. And then, if none of that is working to keep the pain of the exiles down, then suicide is like the ultimate escape, the ultimate way to get away from pain, right? So there's a good intention there, and we recognize that. And Dick Schwartz talks about there being kind of different kinds of suicidal firefighters, and I won't go into huge detail about it, but there can be ones that seem like they feel terrible and just want to escape, or others that seem like they're murderous in a sense. And we'll see in this example that in that case, it's actually a couple different parts. This was really eye-opening to me. A suicidal part can often be in response to a really harsh inner critic that is creating so much pain inside of a person. So let me just go ahead and read this. This is from page 146. And Martha says, suicide parts can be proactive and soothing, such as, don't worry, there's always a way out. Or they might be reactive and dangerous, like now is the time to die. Those are the ones that usually people are very afraid of for good reason. So here's an example. This is Rui. Rui was a 29-year-old single, gender non-binary Portuguese American who came to therapy complaining of social isolation and hypersensitivity in relationships. So Rui's manager is speaking here. She says, I cannot stand to disappoint anyone. I'm embarrassed to say that I start to think about killing myself if someone looks disappointed. Okay, so again, this is this part that feels like other people being disappointed equals death. It's so painful, right? The therapist says, well, how do you feel toward this part who can't stand to disappoint? And Rui says, very close. So this usually indicates that Rui's probably blended with that part right now. So the therapist tries to clarify, do you mean spatially or emotionally? And Rui says spatially, and pats the left side of their head, says it's right there, right? So that's interesting information. And the therapist says, so what happens to this part when someone seems disappointed? Rui says, I panic. I can't think about anything else. I wake up in the night and I can't stop thinking about whatever happened. And then this other part says, well, you should just die. So again, now she's teased out that this is actually two parts, right? It's the part that can't handle feeling the disappointment, and the part that says, well, then let's just escape and die. So the therapist says, so what's happening when you can't think about anything else? So just kind of going back, she talked, or they talked, Rui talked about, someone's disappointed and then they're just ruminating in their mind. And Rui says, when that happens, a voice yells at me. The therapist says, whose voice? Rui says, it's my father's. And the therapist says, what does the voice yell? So the therapist is just very curious here. And Rui says that I'm making really big mistakes, that I'm bad. The therapist says, is that one of your parts using his voice, or is it him acting inside of you? So the therapist here is trying to differentiate between, like, is this a part who's taken on some of your father's energy or is kind of presenting that way? Or does he actually have some of your father's energy, which might be a legacy burden or perhaps a perpetrator part? And then I won't go into too much about this, but sometimes really harsh inner critics or even suicidal parts can be UBs, meaning they're not a part. They're something totally outside of us. And the thing, you don't have to be afraid of it. You can just go in directly and ask, are you a part of this person? And they will answer truthfully. Sometimes they'll try to dodge the question, but they will often answer, yes, this is a part, or this percentage is me, and this percentage is from my father. And then you know that that percentage is a legacy burden. But Rui says it's my part. And they may already know this part. So the therapist says, is this part yelling at you now? And Rui nods. Would it be willing to stop and tell us what it's worried about? So Rui calls this part the hammer. So Rui's hammer says, the worry is that I'm an idiot. So the therapist interrupts and says, I know this part is good at its job, but we want to know why it does this job. Would it take just a few minutes now and do something different? So the part is continuing to hammer on Rui, and it's really saying you're an idiot to another part, but so the therapist is saying, well, we know you're really good at being an inner critic, and we want to know why, though. We really feel curious about why you do what you do. And if the therapist and the client is coming from self, if they're genuinely curious and not feeling judgmental, usually the part will agree to that. So after a pause, Rui nods, and the therapist says, can you see the hammer? Or can you see the part? And Rui says, yes, it's a hammer. The therapist says, is the hammer willing to say what is so important about being a hammer? And the hammer part says, I have to be perfect. So this is kind of a perfectionist part. And the therapist says, what happens if you are not perfect? So again, we're trying to look for, what do you protect? What happened? And the hammer says, well, I usually am. The therapist says, but what happens if you're not? The hammer says, everyone suffers. And the therapist says, and then what? And this can be a good question. And then what? And what does that mean? That kind of thing. Really trying to get through the layers of what ultimately do you protect or are you afraid of? And even when the hammer says everyone suffers, immediately you can hear the good intention. The hammer's desire is that people don't suffer, right? So and likely parts inside of Rui. So the therapist says, everyone suffers, and then what? And the hammer says, and it's bad. So the therapist gets curious and says, who is everyone? Right? Who are you referring to? Rui says, my father's mad, my mother gets upset, my sister acts up, or my sisters act up, and then their teachers are unhappy, and it's just on and on and on. Everybody in the family is basically what this part is saying. And the therapist says, oh, it's like a domino effect. Rui nods. And the therapist says, can we get curious about this? Again, Rui nods. When you're not perfect, everyone suffers. And then what happens inside of you? So the part has said what happens on the outside, all the family members, all the people suffer. And then what happens in the inner family, right? And Rui says, despair. The therapist says, and what do you believe about yourself? So here, this question, what do you believe about yourself, is really getting at what's the burden of this part holding despair. And the despair is also a burden. Rui says that I'm not up to it. Therapist says, and then what happens? Rui says, and then it feels like it would be easier to die. So they're really getting the order of things here, right? This perfectionist comes in because they're protecting a part that feels like, if I'm not perfect, all the suffering is going to happen, a part that experienced that. And then there's despair because it can't work ultimately. And then the overwhelm of the despair part causes this suicidal firefighter to come in and say it's easier to die. So the therapist says, how does the hammer feel about that when the suicide part comes in? Rui says, it wants me to be perfect, not dead. So it just hammers harder. The therapist says, so has it succeeded in making you perfect? And Rui laughs. Now, when we ask this from a place of self, sometimes if you ask it from a part, it's like, well, has that worked for you? Kind of snarkily, the parts won't respond well. But when you're genuinely asking, and they can say yes or no, because sometimes parts will say, yeah, it has worked for me, right? But you can say, it seriously, like, has it worked for you? I'm curious, because you want to know if they're feeling proud of their job, or maybe overwhelmed and tired, desperate with it. So Rui laughs, which means like, yeah, kind of, you found me out, it doesn't work. So the therapist says, is this part tired? Rui nods. Would it be interested? This is the hammer. Would it be interested in an experiment? It could put the hammer down for a bit and meet with you and the suicide part. So now again, like the last video I shared, Martha is bringing in these two polarized parts to meet together with the self so that they can begin to see each other and their good intentions. So Rui considers this and then says, okay. And the therapist does the same conference table, says, meet them at a conference table. So Rui brings the hammer and the suicide part together at a conference table. And the therapist says, do they see you? You always want to make sure that the parts are aware of the self at the table. And Rui nods. Are they ready to talk? Rui nods again. And how do you feel toward the hammer now? So the therapist is trying to assess to make sure that Rui is in self energy. So, and then Martha has a note here that says, I continue to focus on the critic who drives this dynamic. The suicide part is reacting to the hammer's criticism, right? So this is what I was saying before. The hammer, the critic, is actually what's creating so much turmoil and pain and despair in the system, that the suicidal part is responding to that. It's so unbearable. Let's just take you out. My system really relates to this, my parts are saying right now. So the therapist is focusing on the part that seems to be the most burdened, that the other one's reacting to, and then letting that one listen. So that's why she's focusing on that. And so Rui says it's not helping, right? The hammers, it's not really effective. And then the therapist says, and given that it's not helping, how do you feel toward it? So she's checking again, because she didn't answer how she's feeling, or they didn't answer how they were feeling toward it. Rui shrugs. And the therapist says, is it okay to be curious? And Rui nods. So the therapist says, who does it protect? Rui says, it says me. So this means that the hammer doesn't see Rui as an adult, as the self, right? If the hammer sees Rui as the one it protects, it's likely seeing Rui as a younger part. So, or it may be just seeing that it protects the whole system, right? Just everyone in Rui's system. So the therapist asks, how old does the hammer think you are? Rui says, all ages. So this is interesting. It does seem like it's protecting the whole system, perhaps, or perhaps many ages. And the therapist says, when did it start this job? So this is kind of getting at when was the very first incident when this was needed. Rui says, when I was 6 or 7. And the therapist says, does that make sense to you? Rui nods. And the therapist says, ask this kid, the 6 or 7-year-old kid, to sit next to you so that the hammer and the suicide part can see who you really are. So again, she's doing this technique of unblending the exile. Now there's 2. Here I am, the adult, whatever, how old was Rui? 29-year-old Rui here, and the 6 or 7-year-old part next to them. And then the hammer and the suicide part can see them both. And Rui's self can say, what if I could take care of this 6 or 7-year-old part? And then again, that's going to be how the polarization can be relaxed and the system harmonized, is once the self, the 29-year-old Rui that's not a part, can begin reparenting and caring for the 6 or 7-year-old, going back to the times when they felt just in so much despair and redoing those moments, right? And now having someone there with them. So, and then Martha just gives us this little paragraph here explaining that Rui's suicide part came on the heels of despair, the feeling of an exile who was reacting to the inner critic, the hammer. So that's a good summary. I always ask critics if they are succeeding. Sometimes they cite small victories, that's true, but mostly they admit to feeling unsuccessful and tired, which is our opportunity to offer help. In contrast, this is a good note here, firefighter parts like Rui's suicide part are just concerned with short-term results. So usually they're like, yeah, I'm effective. I'm taking them out in this moment. So they will only consider the long-term costs of their behavior if they believe that the client's self can handle the feelings that recruit them to their jobs in the first place. Because what the firefighter will say is, if I don't come in and do this, then the client's taken over by despair and they cannot handle it. So the only way the firefighter is going to agree to relax is if they trust that the client's adult, loving, wise self can take care, again, of this 7-year-old child who's feeling overwhelmed by despair. And then if they trust that, then they don't have to come in anymore. So for this reason, we want firefighters to watch as the client self asks managers to dial down. And we want both managers and firefighters to see that the client self can help the exile. If the manager says it will only dial down if the firefighter does, we negotiate a simultaneous de-escalation. It's like, you know, the 2 people hanging out of the boat and you're like, okay, I'm in the middle. I'm going to just grab each of your hands. And if you'll both just come in just a little bit, just so that you can see me and maybe do an experiment, see what I can or can't do with the exile. I know you don't need to trust me until you have evidence, but just see maybe what I can do. So we're always negotiating, never forcing any of the parts to do anything. There's always just utter respect for every part because it's doing what it's doing for a reason. We never want it to force it to stop because then there will be backlash in the system. So I hope you appreciated that example. I just thought it was a really eye-opening example of this dynamic between a really harsh inner critic and a suicidal firefighter coming in to basically rescue the system from this big critic. Like I said, my system really related to that. So share in the comments if you have any questions or comments or experiences you want to share.